So as we're applying our theories, there's this idea of relativism that always comes into play. Relativism basically argues that things differ, that there are no universal truths or values, but that everything varies based on context, culture, situation to situation. The implication from relativism is that there really is no all right, all wrong way to behave, that there are some right ways and there are some wrong ways, and they are what they are. And of course, relativism isn't a single construct. There are different types of relativism, and we'll talk about those and how they vary here in the next few slides. And of course, this cartoon gives you a great example of what it means to apply relativism to, say, for example, the Ten Commandments. Now, they're open to interpretation. It's all relative, right? And of course, it's a humorous example, but nonetheless, it's a great way to illustrate what relativism is. So there are several different forms of relativism: naive relativism, role relativism, social group relativism, cultural relativism, and then ultimately ethical relativism, which has some bearing on the way that we think about, are there universal ways of behaving across cultures, across different groups. Interesting to think about that. So naive relativism is this idea that anything goes, that really I make my own standards for what I think is appropriate and no one else can judge what I am, that it's all about what I think is right or wrong, regardless of what society might say or how others might judge me. And so basically it's sort of, if it feels good, then fine. If it feels good to me, then I'm going to do that. And that's a very naive approach, and that's not the kind of relativism we're thinking about. The goal here isn't that, we can only, everybody gets to judge their own way. That's sort of a nihilistic perspective, in my opinion. I mean, really what it comes down to is, it's more complex than this idea of naive relativism. And people who really believe in universalism, a lot of times will go to the argument that, it may end up like this. It may end up to be in a situation where everybody gets to do whatever they want to do, and they make a slippery slope argument that therefore, what is right in my culture is should be right in every culture, and that doesn't always play out, appropriately. We have to recognize that there are differences in different cultures and what they consider to be the norm or what's considered to be appropriate behavior. And while I'm not criticizing the argument that relativism and naive relativism is a bad thing, it definitely is. It definitely creates chaos, right? Because there's no uniform way to behave, so everybody does whatever they want to do in the end, because if it feels good, they do it. So naive relativism tends to lead to things like hedonism and stuff like that, where people just, egoism, doing whatever they want to do. But, at the same time, not every argument for relativism is going to end up as naive relativism. So, there's a balanced approach there. In role relativism, you can see the young woman there who ended up in prison, Lindy, I can't remember her last name, Lindy something. She went to prison because she was humiliating Iraqi prisoners at Abu Ghraib. And the argument that she was making is that my public persona, my public self, I was doing basically, I was playing a role. I was doing what was expected of me and what people told me to do. And one could argue that perhaps that's true, right? On the other hand, however, you can look at the situation in that she's smiling with a cigarette hanging from her mouth. So clearly she seemed to be having a good time. You could look at the situation with the Nazis and Nazi soldiers after World War II, and they said, this was the role that we had to play. This is what we had to do to survive. I didn't create these atrocities. He created, Hitler created the atrocities, and therefore I shouldn't be held liable, for his orders. But the thing is, they made the choice to behave in those ways. So they made the choice to follow. There were plenty of people that didn't follow Nazis. There were plenty of people that left and fled the country. There are plenty of people who fought back, in the underground. So, it's really hard to separate your public persona from your private self, because most people will assume they're one and the same, and we become liable for our behaviors. There's an accountability to what we do and why we do it, and that's where, this role relativism argument can fall apart very, very easily, because Just because you expect me to do that doesn't mean I should. And, sometimes we have to sort of fight the good fight in order to get out of that role, whatever it is. So social group relativism means that the social norms of our organization, our culture, the groups that we hang around with, that these are the things that we should pay attention to for rendering ethical judgments. Sort of go into that external compass as we were talking about in the very first lecture, that the social norms are the things that dictate what is considered ethical or not. But that assumes, of course, that those social norms are appropriate. Social norms for one group are not the same social norms for a different group. So if you're only basing your norms on your small social group, that creates problems of haves and have-nots, right? It's, where privilege happens for some groups and not for others. And so we can start to see where those differences come into play. And we're not going to end up with the same sorts of norms across the board. They won't be uniform norms. So cultural relativism gets this idea that there's not a universal moral code in which to judge a society's morals and ethical standards, because every society has very different points of views on what they consider to be moral or ethical. And a great example here is looking at, this National Geographic slide. I'm quite certain it's what it's from. And we're looking at people there dressed, not dressed at all, that they have no clothes on, and they are in different shapes and sizes, and they are there publicly out with each other. And in our culture, we would consider that completely inappropriate behavior. But in their culture, that's completely appropriate. So it varies from culture to culture about what is considered to be right or wrong or appropriate or inappropriate. So how do we tell them that what they're doing is wrong or immoral? We did this, of course. I mean, that's part of what colonialism was about. We spread Western values and said, this is the way you need to behave, this is what's godly, and this is what's good. And we realized that was, now, that it was a horrible approach to things, because, what I consider to be right or wrong is not necessarily, what's appropriate in your culture. What you're doing in your culture is appropriate for your culture. That's one way to think about that. So ultimately, ethical relativism argues that there's no standard for judging morality except within my own culture. And that's where that cultural relativism sort of builds from cultural relativism. And there's something to be said for that. And we'll listen to a case when we get into class that addresses some of those issues and try to think a little bit more about relativism. Is that true? Is it true that there is only the judgment of morality or ethicality, only within my culture, and it's hard for me to tell someone in a different culture what they can or cannot or should not do. That'll be an important case discussion that we'll have. So in the end, how do we make moral judgments? As we think about these issues of relativism and think about the different theories that we've talked about, does it mean that all ethical practices are acceptable? Not necessarily. Certainly if someone's following their ethical code, we can say it may be appropriate within a particular ethical code, but just because I might feel like my intentions were good, even if the outcomes weren't good, doesn't mean I'm not accountable legally for my outcomes. It might be an ethical behavior, but it may not necessarily be legal. Are cultural differences irresolvable? And that's a huge issue to debate. I think to some extent there are some universal norms. I think people would argue that, but I think that there are nuances in terms of what is culturally appropriate in one group and not for another. And so, this idea that it's immoral, to not wear clothes, where did that come from? Well, that's, it comes from a certain frame of reference and a certain ideal about what is considered to be godly or good. And it's very different for a different culture that believes in sort of more of a natural approach to things. How do you handle it? So is it possible to have a cross-cultural agreement? I would hope so, at some extent. To some extent. I think that there are probably some universal values. I don't think that there's no universal values. I do think there are some. But that creates all the problems and the wars and the conflicts that we have, because most people don't want to think about where there may be some overlap and some agreement, and it becomes an us versus them. I'm right and you're wrong. And as you saw, that's the basis for a lot of fighting and a lot of arguments and a lot of pain and suffering for people when we believe we're right and everybody else is wrong. Alternatively, are there universal values of conduct that seem to, cross all those barriers? And I think so. Is it only one set? Probably not. There may be different standards, but I don't know which standard it should hold. Is it a religious value? And if so, which religion? Is it the Bill of Rights? Well, that's the United States Bill of Rights, but is that something that every country should follow? We would think so, but that's not always the right approach. What about the UN Declaration of Human Rights? Is that appropriate? Most of the countries in the world have signed on to it. Does that mean everybody agrees to it and interprets it the same way? Therein lies our challenges as well. So Universalism argues that there's an enormous number of different universal rights: the right to privacy, the right to freedom of conscience, the right to due process, to minimal education, to political participation, and to subsistence. Are these all the universal rights that there are? Should there be more? Do we think everybody should agree to that? Does everybody universally agree that these rights are the ones that we need to hold on to? Well, what is a minimal education? Minimal here in the United States versus minimal in, say, India, or minimal in Mongolia. Do we all agree on what that minimal education is? And maybe that's the issue, is that maybe there is a universal right, but it allows for the interpretation at the cultural level. That, for us, we think a minimal education is K through 12 and perhaps even to go to college. That people should have that right to access that. But perhaps in Mongolia or agrarian cultures, simply going to learn how to read and write and those basics to figure, to do numbers, and is all that you really need to know how to do in order to live in that agrarian culture. So it's sort of interesting to think about how we can bring relativism into universalism. Is it even feasible or possible to be able to do that? Lastly, I think overall our aim is to see how all of these different tensions, different factions, different ideals, personal ethics, societal norms, traditions, our goal is to figure out where that consensus is. And if we enter into every situation, every negotiation, every relationship we have looking for that consensus, we'll find society may work in a much better way, much more conducive way than it does now. As long as we say my values are right and your values are wrong, we all think we're right and everybody else is wrong. And so we're going to all be constantly fighting and at issue with each other. The goal of trying to find consensus and understanding and meeting someone halfway is a big part of what's going to benefit, I think, society as a whole in terms of developing ethical cultures, ethical norms, and minimizing fighting, wars, anxiety. But that's my own ideals personally. That's my own soapbox, and I'll own that. But maybe I'm a little Pollyanna about it. But I think it's certainly something to aspire to. I do think that that's where our approach is eventually going. Is where do we find the consensus among all of these different tensions to ultimately figure out what is the right way to be? How should we behave? It's going to be the lifelong challenge, of course.